Welcome to Cocktails with a Curator. I am Xavier Salomon, the Deputy Director and Peter J. Sharp Chief Curator at the Frick Collection. In Dante's Divine Comedy, Dante and the ancient poet Virgil visit hell and purgatory before then Dante ascends to paradise. And in the middle of the book, in the 11th canto of Purgatory, Dante encounters people who had been proud during their lifetime, and they are in purgatory for a certain amount of time, waiting to be welcomed in paradise after they spend a certain amount of years in purgatory. And here you see an illustration from the 1860s by the French artist Gustave Doré, who illustrated famously the Divine Comedy. And here you see Dante leaning over with Virgil behind him as the proud souls pass in front of them. And the proud souls are crushed under large stones, and they carry large stones up the mountain. And that is to reflect the idea of how the burden of pride sort of crushed them during their lifetime. Now, when Dante is in purgatory in this canto, he encounters one of the very few artists in the Divine Comedy, and he encounters a miniature painter called Oderisi da Gubbio. And Oderisi was an artist active at the end of the 13th, early 14th century in Bologna. He was originally, as the name suggests, from Gubbio. And Oderisi speaks under the weight of the stone to Dante. And as he's talking to him, he comes up with a very famous sentence, a famous part of the specific canto, where he says, "Oh, empty glorying in human power, how short a day the crown remains in leaf, if it's not followed by a duller age. In painting, it was Cimabue's belief he held the field. Now Giotto's got the cry, and Cimabue's fame is dim." And Dante is almost a contemporary of Cimabue and of Giotto. He's older than Giotto. But this passage remains a very famous one in telling us about the changes in fashion. And of course, the idea is that a great, proud artist like Cimabue thought he was the greatest artist at the time until Giotto came along. And then, of course, Giotto becomes more famous than his master, and he is forgotten. This passage in the Divine Comedy, plus Vasari's lives of Cimabue and Giotto, written, of course, later on in the 16th century, kind of captured the imagination of the 19th century world, and especially 19th century artists. So that one of the very commonly represented scenes in French and Italian paintings at the second half and end of the 19th century is another story relating to these two painters, to Cimabue and Giotto. And this is a story which is recalled by Vasari as well, where Cimabue, as an older man, as a successful artist, is traveling in the outskirts of Florence, and he stumbles upon a young child, a child around 10 years old, who is tending to a flock of sheep in the countryside. And in his spare time, he is just sketching the sheep on a rock. And of course, Cimabue immediately recognizes the talent of this young artist, takes him under his wing, trains him, and of course, this young boy is Giotto. Now, we now know that this is probably not true, and we know that Giotto may not even have trained with Cimabue. It's a very contested topic. But what I am talking about today is this very small panel at the Frick Collection, which is the one and only work by Cimabue in a public collection in the United States. And as we will see, it's a work that has had a rather complex and interesting attributional history. But it brings me to talk about one of the founding fathers of Western art, or Western painting. And Cimabue is often described by Vasari, but by many other sources also subsequently, as the person who really moved the style of painting in Europe from what we now call a Byzantine style, so in a style that is embedded in a previous tradition of late antiquity and early in the Middle Ages, referring, of course, to Byzantium, the capital of the Roman Empire after the fall of Rome and the movement of the capital to Constantinople, Byzantium. So the tradition of sort of icon paintings on gold grounds with religious figures that are rather static and follow a tradition which is all about the repetition of standard imagery of the Virgin Mary or Christ, is then broken down in a way and challenged by artists like Cimabue to begin with, but of course then by Giotto and by the artists of the early Renaissance. Because we're talking about a painting with a gold ground, and gold is such a prominent feature in this painting, I'm having a golden cocktail. This is actually called a gold rush. It was a cocktail invented in New York in the 1920s, and it is made out of bourbon, honey syrup, and lemon juice. Cheers. So who was Cimabue? Cimabue, as I say, is one of the key figures in the history of Western art as we know it, as it is usually told. It is worth remembering that many artists before Cimabue are not recorded by the name. So there are many instances of great painters in the Middle Ages in Italy and in the rest of Europe about whom we know very, very little. And in fact, even about Cimabue, we don't really know very much. There are very few works by him that survive, and these are all religious works. And here I'm showing you, for example, two of his rather grand, very large size crucifixes. The one on the left is in the church of San Domenico in Arezzo, in Tuscany. The one on the right, very damaged, is in the church of Santa Croce in Florence. And unfortunately, the way you see it on the right, even though it was restored, is the consequence of the terrible damage the painting suffered in 1966 when the Arno, the river, flooded Florence, and many works of art were very badly damaged or destroyed. Here you see people rescuing the large crucifix, and you get a sense of how large this work is, which had collapsed into the mud and the water in the Church of Santa Croce, and of course was damaged for good. And even though it's been restored, it is a much damaged painting today, unfortunately. So Cimabue painted these sort of works, but also he's famous for his maestà. The maestà as a concept is a large painting showing the Virgin and Child enthroned, surrounded by angels in majesty, hence the name maestà. And these are two of Cimabue's maestà that survive. The one on the left was made for the Franciscans in Pisa, and this was made in the 1280s for the Church of San Francesco in Pisa, and it's now at the Louvre. And the one on the right instead was made for the Church of Santa Trinita in Florence about 10 to 20 years later, 1290s, early 1300s. But again, you see how the gold background is fundamental in these works of art. The rigidity of the figures, the sort of static, enthroned image, relating, of course, to older models and icons. But you also see how Cimabue is beginning to break those boundaries. And of course, you see that the angels are set one on top of the other. So there is the beginning of a spatial suggestion in this. And of course, perspective is not really reinvented by the Western world until several decades later, but there is a play with space in painting that, of course, between antiquity and the Renaissance is there, and it's explored in a number of different ways. And Cimabue is really one of the people, and then Giotto, who pushes the limits of representation as we know it in the Western world. These are also very, very large paintings, massive panels. And to give you a sense, here is a photo of the room at the Uffizi in Florence that has in front of you the Maestà by Cimabue. On the left, one by Giotto, by his so-called pupil. And on the opposite side, there is also one by Duccio, who was another painter of that period from Siena. And this gives you a sense about how grand these works were and how they would have looked incredibly impressive in churches in Tuscany at the time. This idea of Cimabue as the great painter of the Maestà and these type of paintings is again celebrated in the 19th century. And here I'm showing you Lord Leighton's painting of Cimabue parading his Madonna and Child through the streets of Florence. This was, of course, painted in the 19th century, but it sort of goes back to a number of the stories we've talked about. And you see at the center, dressed in white with a laurel wreath, Cimabue carrying this work through the streets, accompanied, holding hands next to him. The young boy, of course, is Giotto. And there are stories we know, for example, that Duccio paraded the great Maestà for the high altar of Siena Cathedral through the streets of Siena, from his workshop to the cathedral. And it was common for these large works created for public sites to be brought in procession and be celebrated as great works of art. Cimabue also worked in one of the great sites of medieval Italy. This is the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi. Here you see the lower church. There are two churches, one on top of the other, and you see that it's entirely frescoed, the entire church, and that's true of the upper church as well. This was a cycle which was pushed forward by a number of popes and over a long period of time. But Pope Nicholas IV, who was a Franciscan pope, was particularly keen, obviously, on the decoration of Assisi, having been a Franciscan himself. This is the mother church of the Franciscan order and where St. Francis is buried and where the town in which St. Francis lived. Cimabue painted works both in the lower and upper church at Assisi. And to give you an example, here again is another form of Maestà in fresco, Virgin and Child enthroned, surrounded by four angels. And on the right, you see one of the earliest images of St. Francis of Assisi in the church where he's buried. And of course, that is interesting to us at the Frick, as we have the great Bellini St. Francis, which of course is a very different depiction of St. Francis from several centuries later. So the work at the Frick is a work that was acquired by the museum in 1950. I've talked a lot about how Mr. Frick, Henry Clay Frick, was not particularly interested in early Renaissance works. His main focus of collecting was in different areas, both in terms of chronology and geography. And the early Italian pictures were a real interest of his daughter, of Helen Clay Frick. And so in 1950, this small panel is acquired. It shows the Flagellation of Christ. So this is one of the moments of the Passion of Christ, one of the key moments in the gospel stories. So as Christ is arrested and judged, he's then tied to a column and whipped by soldiers before then being condemned to death and crucified. And so here you see Christ very elegantly attached to this very slender column made out of marble, presumably a sort of depiction of something like porphyry, with these two men whipping them on each side, and buildings in the background, which of course give a sense of space and place. This is of course set in ancient Jerusalem, but what Cimabue is doing with this painting is he's really sort of playing with these different ideas of space. So the way in which the two executioners interact with the body of Christ and are set in front of these buildings. Of course, it's done in a rather crude way as far as we're concerned today, but for the time, this was a very novel way of depicting space and depicting a particular narrative. Most of the works we've seen by Cimabue are very large. The crucifixes, the frescoes, of course, and the Maestàs. But this is instead a very small devotional work. And there isn't really a lot like it, which brought a big debate when the Frick acquired the painting as to who this painting was actually by. And the Anglo-Saxon and Italian art historians working on Cimabue on this period reached very different conclusions. And there was a very long discussion from the 50s onwards, really for about 50 years, as to who had painted this work. The painting has a little inscription on the back, but fairly modern, probably from the 19th century, saying Cimabue. And when it was acquired by the Frick, it was acquired as a Cimabue. But two of the great Anglo-Saxon art historians of the time did not agree with this attribution at all. So Millet Mies on the left, who of course wrote one of the great books on art in Tuscany after the plague, and who also wrote very beautifully about the Bellini St. Francis at the Frick, and who was teaching in New York, he was absolutely convinced that the small flagellation at the Frick was not by Cimabue, was not a Florentine picture, but was actually a Sienese picture, and it was by Duccio. And so John Pope Hennessy, who you see on the right, also agreed with Millet Mies and attributed for most of his life the little painting to Duccio, only supposedly later in life to start having doubts about this and thinking that maybe it was more Cimabue-like than he had believed before that. On the other hand, in Italy, the Italian art historian Roberto Longhi, who you see here on the left, was the one who from the 1950s onwards always defended the attribution of the small painting to Cimabue. And in that, he was accompanied by Bernard Berenson, who was living in Italy, of course, originally from Lithuania, but Americanized and then transferred in Tuscany and lived in Tuscany most of his life. Berenson agreed with the Cimabue attribution, but had doubts about it and thought that maybe it was designed by Cimabue and produced by Cimabue's workshop. So different debates, which meant that the painting for the 50 years between 1950 and 2000 was really described at the Frick and catalogued as Tuscan school. The curators at the Frick didn't really take sides between this debate between Florence and Siena, between Cimabue and Duccio, and the painting was left in this limbo. This continued until 2000, when a small painting, same size and very similar to the Frick painting, was discovered in Suffolk in England, and it shows an enthroned Virgin and Child with two angels, and this is unmistakably the work of Cimabue. It turns out that the punching in the gold, the treatment of the gold, the way in which the figures are painted is exactly the same as the Frick painting. And this was noted and studied by a great curator at the National Gallery in London, Dillian Gordon, who made this discovery, connected the Frick picture with the recently found one in England, and at the same time in 2000, acquired this painting, this Cimabue, for the National Gallery in London, where it is today. And this proved that these two works, everyone had thought until then that the Flagellation was an independent work, a single small work for private devotion. But it actually turns out that it was part of a much larger ensemble, much larger group of objects. And this involved, of course, the Virgin and Child from London. And there were a series of studies, technical and art historical studies, which proved that these two works are clearly painted on the same type of wood, and they were actually originally part of the same work. It must have been something along these lines. This is a 14th century diptych. Diptych, of course, being a work made out of two panels, attached by hinges, which you can close and open like a book. And this diptych, which is from the Virginia Museum of Art in Richmond, a work from the 14th century at the same time, slightly later than Cimabue, shows how our painting may have looked like originally. So these are 8 scenes of the Passion of Christ, starting with a nativity at the upper left and finishing at the lower right with an image of the Virgin and Child surrounded by St. Francis and St. Clare. But in the middle, you see the crucifixion, the kiss of Judas, a number of episodes, the deposition, a number of episodes from the Passion of Christ. And what was proposed by Dillian Gordon and by subsequent art historians from 2000 onwards is that both the Flagellation and the Virgin and Child were part of a complex of this kind, which for unknown reasons was cut down and each scene was then kept separately. We've spoken already about the division of works of art with Piero della Francesca. That was obviously a large altarpiece. This was a smaller private devotional object, which may have been damaged or for reasons unknown to us, was cut to pieces. Both the Frick piece and the National Gallery one seems to have had a provenance from France. And so the likelihood is that this diptych in its entirety, or at least part of it, reached France before the 19th century and then either already in pieces or was cut to pieces then, and then they went different ways. The idea of bringing the two remaining fragments together, the London one and the Frick one, took place in 2006 when the Frick collection did a small exhibition curated by Holly Flora in our cabinet gallery, where you can see on the end wall the Virgin and Child from London and the Frick Flagellation brought together with similar works. So, for example, there is another larger diptych on the left by Pacino di Bonaguida from the Metropolitan Museum, giving a sense of how these two objects would have fit together. Of course, there are pieces missing, and one of the big questions was always, where are the other pieces? Do any of them survive? And this remained a mystery until 2019, until the summer of 2019, when a third panel was discovered in France. And this is a very recent, well-known story where this small panel was discovered in the kitchen of a lady in a house in France, and was discovered to be also by Cimabue, and to fit with the Frick and the National Gallery panels. This shows another scene from The Passion of Christ, the mocking of Christ. So this is when the soldiers are making fun at Christ, surrounding him. And again, you just see this interesting spatial interest of Cimabue, where the way the figures are placed one on top of the other. And of course, here you see it in a sort of rather dirty state, but the condition of this picture is actually pretty good. The painting was sold at auction at the end of 2019 and acquired by a private collector. And we all hope that one day these paintings can be brought together. I went to inspect the painting. Here I am with the painting in my hands. And you can see how small these works are. And you can imagine that the diptych would have been obviously a somewhat larger work, but still something very portable and something clearly created for an individual patron, presumably for his or her private devotions. This is a scheme made by the French scholars who studied the painting when the third one was discovered, giving us a sense of what this diptych may have looked like. And we know, because of the analysis of the wood and the way in which the panels work in terms of their configuration, that the National Gallery painting would have been top left, with below it the newly discovered Mocking of Christ, and to the side the Flagellation, which means that there is a missing scene of this left panel, possibly the Kiss of Judas. We don't know. If we're looking at the history of the Passion of Christ, that's what would make sense. And we don't have any surviving scenes on the right panel. It may mean that the right panel was damaged and maybe destroyed, and only pieces of the left panel survived, which may give us some hope that there may be a fourth piece still somewhere in France. As I mentioned, all three pieces were found or came at some point from France, so I suspect the other pieces may still be there waiting to be discovered. But this gives you a sense of how discovery and rediscovery and the study of works of art by curators, by scholars, improves our knowledge of these kinds of works of art. This, until 2000, the Frick painting was an unknown entity in many ways. The attribution was still very debated. Between 2000 and now, over a period of 20 years, two pieces of the puzzle have been added, and the attribution has been confirmed to Cimabue. We think that it is likely that this diptych was painted for someone in Pisa, probably, when Cimabue was in Pisa. But again, the precise circumstances of the commission of this work remain mysterious. So when you see this work at the Frick, of course, think that it is a fragment of a much larger whole. But it is also worth remembering that this is an incredibly rare object for us. So if we're looking at the great father of Western painting, as I said, this is the only work by him that can be seen by the public in America, in an American collection. And so we're very proud, obviously, at the Frick to be able to display this together with a number of works by other early Italian masters like Duccio, like Barna da Siena, and later artists like, of course, Piero della Francesca, Gentile da Fabriano, and Paolo Veneziano in Venice. So I hope you will all come and visit us soon at Frick Madison, where we have created an entire room of gold grounds of early Italian paintings, and where the Cimabue is displayed together with works by other artists. Thank you for joining me this evening, and I look forward to seeing you at the next episode of Cocktails with a Curator.